welcome to episode 134 of the People's History of Ideas podcast. This episode, we're going back down to the countryside and picking up the story of Mao Zedong back where we left him in episode 125, when we concluded our discussion of the Gutian Resolution. Since it's been a little while, let's refresh our memories about where we left things with Mao. The Ninth Congress of the Chinese Communist Party and the Fourth Red Army, also known interchangeably as the Gutian Congress or the Gutian Conference, which was held on December 28th and 29th, 1929, marked a definitive turning point in the political development of the Red Army. As we've repeatedly discussed in past episodes of this podcast, since the Sanwan reorganization of 1927, Mao had fought for a vision of how the army should function as a politically engaged weapon of the Communist Party, and the Gutian Congress marked the victory of Mao's line on this question. After the Gutian Conference ended, Mao was at a point where he needed to decide, as he put it, how to appraise the current situation and how to settle the companion question of what action to take. In the midst of Mao's deliberations over the political situation and determining what actions to take, a letter of New Year's greetings arrived from Lin Biao, which helped to focus his thinking. In this letter, Lin expressed a good deal of pessimism about the prospects for the revolution. He thought that for the Chinese Revolution to be successful, first, the masses would have to be won over on a countrywide scale, and that only then could power be seized. And clearly, the party was far from even developing work with the masses in large parts of the country, much less winning them over, and had suffered huge reversals in places like Shanghai and Guangzhou, where it had once been influential because of severe repression. So, what this letter from Lin showed Mao was that even some of the party cadre, who he had most depended on and who tended to align themselves with Mao's positions, for example, in the line struggle with Zhu De about how politicized the Red Army should be, as we discussed in episodes 117 and 118, even these guys didn't necessarily grasp the strategy for the Chinese Revolution that Mao had begun articulating back in the Jinggangshan. So, Mao wrote a reply to Lin Biao on January 5th, 1930. We're going to go through the letter in some detail because it went on to become, in a somewhat altered form, a major piece of the Maoist canon under the title, "A Single Spark Can Start a Prairie Fire." But to summarize some of the main points before we dive in here, what Mao does in this letter is he discusses how the strategy for the Chinese Revolution hinges on the role of the Red Army and the construction and expansion of base areas, how this process actually contributes to bringing about the revolutionary high tide, in the language then current in the Comintern and in the Chinese Communist Party, meaning essentially how it contributes to bringing about favorable conditions for rapidly building the revolutionary movement and perhaps making an attempt at seizing power. And then he makes some additional points where he goes into detail on how the Red Army should be used in this process, particularly expanding on the letter to Zhou Enlai that we discussed in episode 115, and which is quoted at length in this letter to Lin Biao, on the issue of concentrating and dispersing army forces for different political and military tasks. The thing is, for people who have been listening to this podcast, I'm not entirely sure that it's really necessary for us to go into much depth on this document. On the one hand, this document is immensely important because in it, Mao sums up a great deal about the revolutionary strategy that he had been formulating and testing in practice since the failure of the 1927 autumn harvest uprisings. But the thing is, we've been following Mao's development of these ideas closely enough in this podcast that I don't think anything in here is actually going to be new for us. And for that reason, I almost decided to pass over this document very quickly. But I've decided that I do want to look at the document in some depth for two reasons. First, it's an incredibly important historical document because of how it was used to educate both Chinese and later foreign revolutionaries about Mao's breakthroughs in forming a Marxist theory of revolutionary warfare for the countryside of semi-colonial and semi-feudal countries. And second, because for the people who listen to these podcasts when they are released, it's been about a year, maybe a little more, since we talked about Mao and what he was doing, which I totally self-criticize myself for. That is way too long to go without checking in on Mao, and I'll try to do better this year. So a little bit of review of some of Mao's ideas won't hurt us, especially in the concentrated form in which they appear in this letter to Lin Biao. Before we start, just a word on how this document evolved over time, going from being a letter to Lin Biao to a single spark can start a prairie fire. It was included as it was originally written in the 1947 edition of Mao's works, and it's a translation of that edition that we're using in this podcast. Then, when another bigger collection of Mao's works was being put together the next year in 1948, Lin Biao complained to the Central Committee about reprinting the letter again when it was so critical of him. The Central Committee acceded to his request to suppress the letter. So because the books had already been printed, the pages with this letter in them were cut out of the books, like physically cut out. And the title was blotted out in the table of contents. I have to imagine that this raised some questions among readers about what had been removed, although it's important to remember that anyone studying Mao's works at that time was reading them in a different context than most readers today. The reading of political texts in the communist base areas and then after liberation in the People's Republic of China was typically carried out in the context of a discussion group where there would be a responsible cadre whose task was to provide an orientation for the texts being discussed, to facilitate the discussion, and to give clarifying answers to questions about the text. Presumably, these cadres had some sort of explanation in hand about the redacted lines in the table of contents and the pages that had been cut out of the books. In 1951, when another more robust edition of Mao's selected works was being put together, the letter was changed to remove all reference to Lin. It was only in the 1991 edition of Mao's works that Lin was again indicated as the recipient of the letter. That said, the letter may have circulated as a document used in the political training of cadres before being collected in the 1947 edition of Mao's works. In Revolutionary Discourse in Mao's Republic, David Apter and Tony Saich interviewed a former guerrilla who seems to indicate that he was familiar with the letter before first going to Yan'an in 1937. Certainly, given the prominence that the document later achieved in the circulation of Maoism internationally, it wouldn't be surprising if it had earlier been widely used for training purposes in China before its collection in an edition of Mao's selected works in 1947. So, with that bit of background under our belts, let's go ahead and finally enter the year 1930 with Mao Zedong. Comrade Lin Biao. Several days have gone by since New Year, and I still have not replied to your letter. One reason is that some things have kept me busy, and another is that I have been wondering what I should actually write to you. Do I have anything good to offer you? After racking my brain, I still could not find anything suitable, so I put it off. Now I have thought of a few things. Although I do not know whether they really apply to your situation, the few things I have to say are indeed an important problem in the present struggle. Even if it does not apply to your particular circumstances, it is still a crucial general problem, and that is why I am bringing it up. What is the problem that I want to raise? It is the problem of how to evaluate the current situation and what actions we should take in consequence. I felt quite strongly in the past, and to some extent I still feel now, that your evaluation of the situation is rather pessimistic. This viewpoint of yours was most obvious at the meeting on the evening of May 18th last year in Ruijin. May 18th, 1929 would have been right in the midst of the events that we discussed in episode 116. So it is likely that this meeting that Mao is referring to was one at which the decision was taken to move the main the main force of the Fourth Red Army into western Fujian. As we discussed at the time, this decision was made because the fighting between the Guangxi warlords and Chiang Kai-shek had ended for the time being, although it would later pick back up again, and the Kuomintang armies that had been in Jiangxi before the war returned to the area. With the increased pressure from Kuomintang armies in Jiangxi, Mao and Zhu decided to move their main force into western Fujian to continue conquering territory where the Kuomintang was weak. The significance of this context should become apparent as we continue reading Mao's letter and see the particular criticisms that he makes of Lin. So, continuing with the letter, consequently, as far as action is concerned, you do not approve of the plan to take Jiangxi in 1 year and approve only of guerrilla actions in the 3 areas on the borders of Fujian, Guangdong, and Jiangxi. At the same time, you do not have a deep understanding of what it means to establish red political power in the 3 areas and, therefore, do not have a deep understanding of the idea of accelerating the nationwide revolutionary high tide through the consolidation and expansion of red political power. Judging from your belief in the policy of, and here a word has been redacted, so redacted style mobile guerrilla actions, you seem to think that, since the revolutionary high tide is still remote, to undertake the arduous work of establishing political power would be to labor in vain. So, as I mentioned earlier, the translation we're working with here is based on the 1947 edition of Mao's works. And in that edition, this word was redacted. But we can do some informed speculating on what that word was. Just to repeat, Mao wrote about Lin's belief in the policy of blank style guerrilla actions. My best guess is that the redacted word is Taiping, so it would have read Taiping style guerrilla actions. Why do I think this? Because as we discussed in episodes 114 and 124, Lisan and some others in the party center had been promoting the idea that the Taiping revolutionaries, from back in episodes 3 and 4, had a form of military organization that was particularly well suited to guerrilla warfare. Mao came to characterize this line as trying to win a revolution based on roving rebel bands. And back in episodes 114, 124, and elsewhere, we've discussed in some detail how Mao contrasted his own position against this, and we will see him do it again in this letter to Lin Biao that we're now reading. The reason why this might have been redacted is that by 1947, this phrasing, that is, the Taiping style of guerrilla warfare, was long out of use in the Communist Party and would have been confusing for many readers, given that the Communists preferred to emphasize the continuity of their revolution with the Taiping Revolution and that it was a large-scale movement being carried out by impoverished peasant masses. It's also worth mentioning that Li Lisan's idea of what the Taiping guerrilla strategy was more an ideological construction in his own mind and had little resemblance to the actual military operations of the Taiping. All right, back to the letter. Instead, you want to extend our political influence through the easier method of roving guerrilla actions and wait until the masses throughout the country have been won over, or more or less won over, before launching a nationwide insurrection, which, with the participation of the Red Army, would become a great nationwide revolution. Your theory that we must first win over the masses everywhere on a nationwide scale and then establish political power is not, in my opinion, applicable to the Chinese Revolution. As I see it, this theory derives mainly from your failure to understand clearly that China is a semi-colonial country for which imperialism is contending in its final stages. If you clearly recognized this, then you would understand, first of all, why, in the whole world, the strange phenomenon of chaotic warfare within the ruling class is found in China alone. Why this warfare is steadily growing fiercer and more widespread, and why there can at no time be a unified political power. Second, you would understand the grave significance of the peasant problem, and hence why rural insurrections have developed on the present nationwide scale. Third, you would understand the absolute correctness of the slogan of workers' and peasants' political power. Fourth, you would understand another strange phenomenon which follows from the first, that in China alone there is chaotic warfare within the ruling class, namely the existence and development of the Red Army and guerrilla forces, and together with them, the existence and development of small areas of red political power, the Soviets, encircled by the white regime. This strange thing does not exist outside China. Fifth, you would understand that the expansion of the Red Army, the guerrilla forces, and the Soviet areas is the highest form of the peasant struggle in a semi-colony and the form toward which the semi-colonial peasant struggle must move. Sixth, you would understand that they, the Red Army and the Peasant Soviet, are undoubtedly the most significant allied forces of the proletarian struggle in the semi-colonial countries. The proletariat must step forward to lead them, and that they are important factors in promoting the revolutionary high tide throughout the country. And seventh, you would also understand that the policy which merely calls for roving guerrilla actions cannot accomplish the task of promoting this nationwide revolutionary high tide, while the kind of policy adopted by Zhu and Mao, He Long, Li Wenlin, and Fang Zhimin is undoubtedly correct. That is, the policy of establishing base areas, of systematically setting up political power, of close coordination, organization, and training of the Red Army, the guerrilla troops, and the broad peasant masses, of deepening the agrarian revolution, of expanding the armed forces by a comprehensive process of building up first the township insurrection troops, then the district Red Guards, then the county Red Guards, then the local Red Army troops, all the way up to non-local Red Army troops, and of spreading political power by advancing in a series of waves. Only thus is it possible to build the confidence of the revolutionary masses throughout the country, as Soviet Russia has built it throughout the world. Only thus is it possible to create tremendous difficulties for the ruling classes, shake their foundations, and hasten their internal disintegration. Only thus is it really possible to create a Red Army which will become one of the important instruments in the great revolution of the future. In short, only thus is it possible to promote the revolutionary high tide. That was a very long paragraph, and there was a lot in it. It's kind of an extended preamble to everything that's going to follow. First, let's just clarify who some of these people were who Mao named alongside himself and Zhu De as pursuing the policy of establishing base areas and systematically setting up political power based on the close coordination of communist armed forces with the peasant movement. First was He Long, who had led in the formation of a Soviet in the Hunan-Hubei border region. We've seen Mao refer to him admiringly a number of times as we discussed Mao's own political development over the years of this podcast, particularly in his role as an early convert from social banditry to rural social revolutionary. He was from a poor rural family in Hunan and got his start in peasant revolution when he killed a local government tax assessor who had killed his uncle for defaulting on his taxes. He fled to the hills, developed a reputation as a kind of Robin Hood figure, and developed his own small army, which he eventually brought into the National Revolutionary Army. And later he was one of the leaders of the Nanchang Uprising, and now in 1930 he was leading a base area on the Hunan-Hubei border. Li Wenlin was the main leader of the communists in Donggu, in Jiangxi province, who we talked about a bit back in episode 109 when the Fourth Red Army found respite and recuperated in Donggu after retreating from the Jinggangshan. Fang Zhimin was the main leader of another base area, this one in Northeastern Jiangxi province. You'll find this Soviet sometimes referred to as the Xinjiang Soviet, which can be confusing because it refers to the Xin River in northeastern Jiangxi and not to the larger and better known Xinjiang Autonomous Region in China's northwest. Now, to be clear, these other figures who Mao names in the letter had not by any means articulated, as Mao had, a strategy for nationwide revolution based on using the expansion of communist political power in the countryside as a way of hastening the development of an overall favorable national level conjuncture, which would make the nationwide seizure of power possible. But by referring to He Long, Li Wenlin, and Fang Zhimin, Mao makes it clear that there was an ample basis beyond just the experience of the Fourth Red Army for the argument that he's making in this letter. Particularly salient in this document is Mao's sense of the interpenetration of subjective and objective factors in the revolutionary process. How, on the one hand, the revolutionary forces faced objective conditions, but also how they could affect those conditions and help through their own actions to bring about a more favorable historical conjuncture where an attempt could be made to win the revolution. One way of phrasing this, which was developed later on within global Maoism, was the idea of hastening while awaiting. The idea that not just in China, as Mao was arguing in this document, but in any given context, the revolutionary forces should be doing what they can in order to help bring about a revolutionary situation, and indeed that perhaps a revolutionary situation might not even come about without the striving of the subjective forces of revolution. That is, the people who want to bring a revolution about to help make it so. This is counterposed to a more deterministic and mechanical understanding of Marxism and crisis theory, which sees revolutionary situations as arising purely out of the unfolding of the objective workings of the capitalist system and the crises inherent to that system, basically independent of whatever initiative might be exercised by human will. And you can see that more mechanical and deterministic understanding at play in the debates going on at the Party Center in Shanghai at this time about whether the revolutionary high tide, which the Comintern had predicted, was either on the way or had arrived already. Mao's understanding of the issue was much more fluid and contingent and hinged much more on the actions taken by the revolutionaries themselves. And as we dig deeper into this letter next episode, we'll see Mao get much more into the details of his understanding of how to make a revolution in the Chinese context of the 1930s. Until then, be well.